So I left off with the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse and then the 13th Amendment being passed, which abolished slavery in the United States. But neither one of those things are quite as cut and dry and simple as they might seem. So the war is over. South can't secede. Country's back together. Slaves are free. Neither of those are going to be easy to carry out or to handle going forth. So couple of these questions are going to have to be addressed moving forward in the time period called Reconstruction. And so one question is about the southern states. So they had seceded from the country. When they lost the war, they have to be back part of the United States again. Well, does that mean that they just get all of their rights as states and privileges, their representation in federal government back right away? Or should they have to meet certain conditions first? So, like, should they should they be punished further so that they don't try to secede again? Should they just be forgiven so that we can move forward? What about the fact that they're completely devastated physically and economically? So how do you deal with the southern states being readmitted to the country and being rebuilt after the war? So that's a huge question going forward. And as far as freeing the slaves, it seems simple to say, well, slaves are free. But what does that mean, and where does that go from here? Are they just set free and told to, you know, well, you're free, good luck? I mean, they don't have anywhere to go. They don't have a home to go to. They don't have a job or job skills. They don't have money. So you can't just set them free without addressing what they should do now that they are free. Should they be citizens? Should they have all the rights and privileges of citizenship? Should they get to vote? I mean, these are questions that haven't been addressed yet. There's also going to be a huge backlash against the freeing of the slaves, especially in the South, but it occurred all around the country. That just because slaves were no longer, or just because African Americans were no longer slaves, they weren't treated equally. And this whole social structure upon which the country and especially the South had been built, with African Americans at the bottom of the social structure as far as, rights and privileges or anything like that. Well, by freeing the slaves, that social structure is potentially upended. And a lot of southern states feel threatened by that, or a lot of people in southern states felt threatened by that, and they're going to come up with new ways to try to maintain that social order. And they're going to do that through things like Jim Crow laws and discrimination. We'll get to all that later. So, but the issue of what to do about the southern states and what to do about the slaves are going to be the biggest issues going forward into the next unit, which is Reconstruction. So, a lot of slaves, because they didn't have places to go or job skills or anything like that, many of them resorted to what was called sharecropping, and we'll get to more of that later, which is a way that they stayed working in the same places they had been slaves before. And instead of, they're not technically slaves, but they're given a place to stay and a field to work, and told that they can work on this field and stay in this home if they give all of the products of their work to the owner. And we'll talk about that more later, but it's really not that much different than slavery. Some slaves, former slaves, if they had the ability and any money to do so, might try to move. And so some move to cities, some head to factories up north, and some will move out west. And those people will be known as exodusters because they are exodusing, which is a word for escape or leave. They're exodusing from the South, and they're going to go out west and try to make their way as farmers. So we'll talk about that more later too. This just talks about exodusters. We're going to be past that. So this last little bit is what I kind of consider like the credits. Whatever happened to all these people that we talked about through the war. So William Tecumseh Sherman, the guy who burned Atlanta, the guy who marched through Georgia, burning everything in his path, and up through the Carolinas, carrying out total war. What happened to him after the war? A lot of the Civil War leaders for the North, a lot of them went into politics. However, he didn't really want to go into politics. Some people wanted him to run for president, but he didn't do that. Instead, he was promoted to full general. He replaced Grant after the war as the head over the U.S. Army, and he would lead wars out west against Native Americans, and he eventually died in 1891. Robert E. Lee, the famed leader of the Confederate Army, military genius during the war, but definitely was not able to lead the Confederate Army to victory during the war. What happened to him after the war? Well, for a while, he was head over a university called Washington and Lee University, which he helped to found that university. It still exists today. He did face criminal charges after the war because if you think about, treason means waging war against your country. And that's pretty much what he did. As commander over the Confederate Army, he waged war against the United States. So this caused him to be charged with treason. And even after the war, when other Confederate leaders and politicians and people involved were granted a pardon after the war, he never actually got a pardon. He was always accepted, an exception from the people that were pardoned. He later, in 1975, which is 100 years after the war, Congress voted to, or I don't know if it was President Ford actually did it, but issued an honorary pardon. It didn't really matter because he had been dead for 100 years, but he died in 1870. Ulysses S. Grant, leader of the Union forces, head commander of the U.S. Army after the Battle of Vicksburg. He ran for president after the war, served as president for 2 terms as a Republican from 1869 to 1877, and we'll talk about him more when we get to Reconstruction era. Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, nurse during the war, treated soldiers on the battlefield. She went on to start the American Red Cross. The International Red Cross already existed, but she started the American chapter of the Red Cross. Kind of ironic that she died in 1912 due to a cold. Everybody kind of laughs at that, but I mean, by then she was very, very old. So, I mean, she didn't just die from a cold, but kind of makes it sound ironic. Anyway, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. He was also charged with treason after the war, and he was imprisoned for a while, but he was granted pardon during a general amnesty that was issued after the war. He wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, and he died in 1889. Abraham Lincoln. You probably know what happened to Abraham Lincoln, but I don't know if you realize just the sort of time span that happened. So the end of the war was on April 9th, and on April the 14th, he was assassinated. So we're talking about less than a week that he enjoyed the peace of the country not being at war. But on April 14th, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. It was Good Friday, Easter weekend. He was attending a play. And the person who shot him, John Wilkes Booth, was an actor. He wasn't an actor in the play that Lincoln was seeing, but he often performed in that theater, so he knew the back ways around the theater and the layout of the theater really well. So he snuck up to the balcony where Lincoln was sitting, and he shot Lincoln in the back of the head, as you can see in the depiction there. This was a huge plan, though, and what people don't often realize is that there was a massive plot that John Wilkes Booth was carrying out with other people involved and other members of government being targeted. The Vice President, Andrew Johnson, was a target within the plot, as well as the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War. There were a lot of people who were being targeted in this whole plot that Booth had put together and was planning. Lincoln, though, was the only one that ended up actually being killed in the plot. In some of the other cases, the person that was supposed to carry out that part against that person, some of them backed out, some of them weren't successful and were overpowered and they only managed to carry out wounds. Secretary of State Seward, I believe, was wounded, as was Secretary of War Stanton. But Lincoln was the only one out of the whole plot that was killed. Here's Ford's Theater. He was attending a play called Our American Cousin, which was a comedy. And Booth, being an actor himself, very well known acting family, he wasn't the most famous of his family. And some people say that people who have studied Booth and the assassination have said that perhaps his effort to assassinate the president was kind of his way of boosting himself as far as being well known, because he was often overshadowed by his father, who was a huge Shakespearean actor, and his older brother, Edwin Booth. Both of them more famous than he was, and so some people think that maybe he was trying to become more famous by shooting the president, like probably did. By the way, Booth's family, big time Lincoln supporters. Booth himself, not so much, obviously. He was a Confederate sympathizer. His older brother, Booth's older brother, actually helped to save one of Lincoln's children from getting killed at a train station when he fell onto tracks. And Abraham Lincoln actually wrote the Booth family thanking them for what they did to save his son. It's a little bit of irony kind of in there that a lot of the Booth family actually liked Lincoln. And after this whole thing happens, John Wilkes Booth's father basically disowned him for what he did, killing Abraham Lincoln. And later in life, there was an incident where somebody mentioned his children, and he named off all of his kids and left off John Wilkes Booth, basically disregarding that he was even his son. So anyway, here's Ford's Theater. And I was trying to say, John Wilkes Booth, being an actor, he knew the play really well, and so he timed his gunshot to one of the laugh moments during a what do you call it? A punchline in the play. But it didn't take long before people, of course, it screamed that, that the president had been shot. And crazy thing, John Wilkes Booth, he's up in this balcony and he shot the president, and people are kind of screaming. He grabs onto the fabric around the balcony and swings across the audience, landing on the stage, yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus be it ever to tyrants," which is the state motto of Virginia, and lands on the stage, breaks his leg. Okay? But he manages to hobble off the stage, heads out back where he has somebody waiting with a horse for him to be able to escape. He somehow gets up on the horse with his broken leg, rides out of town. While he is on his way out of town, of course, there's telegraph messages being sent to close off all the roads outside of Washington because the president's been shot. But the road that John Wilkes Booth was on, he manages to get through out of town just as they got the message that they needed to stop anybody trying to get out of town. So he got out just in time. So now he's going to be on the run for the next 14 days, I believe it is. First place he stops while he's on the run is a doctor's house, Dr. Mudd, who ends up being implicated in this whole plot for aiding and abetting an assassination of the president. His defense was that he didn't know that John Wilkes Booth had killed the president. He was just being a doctor and setting his leg. But he did end up being convicted as a abettor in the crime. But Booth ends up heading out of town. He's going to be on the run for 14 days. One kind of funny thing is that he didn't have a compass or any sense of direction. So for the next 14 days, while he's hiding out, trying to head towards the South, where he believes he will be welcomed and celebrated for having killed Abraham Lincoln, which, by the way, was not the case, but I'll get to that in a second. He's trying to head south, but what he's really doing is heading in a circle. I think they ended up finding him not too far from Washington, where he was running from. And over the course of 14 days, he had only made it like a couple of miles. That's because he had been going around in circles. So anyway, I will pick up with this story on the next one.